This is my great honor and privilege to give the floor for an opening remark to the elected leader of Belarus, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. The floor is yours. Hello, everyone. Dear Belarusian citizens, international partners, and friends, I'm happy to welcome you to the international conference devoted to the democratic elections in Belarus. It's incredibly important that we're all here to discuss free, fair, and just elections to resolve the crisis in Belarus. Why now? The answer is pretty straightforward. The hijacking of Ryanair plane in Belarusian airspace, persecution of an independent media portal Tudbai, the death of Witold Tashurek in prison, and suicide by 17-year-old Mr. Starkovsky is just part of those horrendous and tragic events that are unfolding in our country. A few minutes ago, we have learned that Stepan Latipov tried to cut his throat in the courtroom because he was threatened that his relatives will be prosecuted as well if he does not confess to something he didn't do. This is unprecedented, and we still haven't reached the peak of repressions. The scale is only increasing. These events are a reminder that none of that would have happened had we not, in August 2020, elections were free and transparent. Therefore, it's time we discuss early elections as a comprehensive solution to the crisis in Belarus. This spring, nearly 800,000 Belarusians participated in an online survey where they expressed support for negotiations leading to new elections. This idea was supported by the international community, and we thank you for that. Both Belarusians and our international partners understand that we are working toward creating a new Belarus, a democratic country where the government, in their decisions, will rely on the will of its people. Therefore, we call to stop violence and release all political prisoners. There are over 450 prisoners, political prisons at the moment, and still rising, and about 1,000 people are in anticipation of being recognized and political prisoners. This is all happening because there was no democratic election, and those who came to power don't feel accountable to Belarusian people. They believe that inflaming hatred and fear will help them hold on to the power. In the meantime, the regime tries to mimic dialogue by putting forward various initiatives and talking to hand-picked associates. That includes the constitutional reform, which does not include any realistic solutions. It's just an imitation of a reform. And we must not allow them to deceive us or to make our plans stall, especially when the regime is going to delay the local elections. We know that the organization of new, free and fair presidential elections is a complex process, which is why we invited our international partners, including election committees of democratic countries, for this experience sharing exercise. We have a lot of representatives from Belarusian political parties, representatives of NGOs and government structures of other countries. We had sent an invitation to the regime representatives. We're open to a dialogue to find a way out of this crisis. Unfortunately, they did not respond to our invites. And yet, I would like to address the Belarusian officials. Lukashenko lost last year's elections, and he knows that. Don't allow him to be dragged into the abyss. Under the constitution, the only source of power in Belarus is the Belarusian people, and you must respect people's will. I call upon you to support Belarusians and together build a new Belarus. Distinguished participants, on day one of the conference, we are going to discuss just how early elections in the shortest time possible will be held. Day two will be all about free elections in the short term. And we'll also talk about long-term reform that Belarus badly needs. We may not find all the solutions in these next 2 days, but we will touch upon relevant topics, have meaningful discussions to be followed by expert discussions. In about a minute, we'll have high-level panel attended by representatives of the European Parliament, OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and IDEA. I'm very happy that they could join us today. I know that Congressman Bill Keating sadly will not be able to join. I've just met 3 senators, US senators, and I know that the American people are behind us on this. I'm also thankful to the IFS, DI, and International IDEA for fruitful cooperation. I'm thankful to everyone who will be in attendance, including representatives of European Central Election Committees. We'd like to discuss just how we can organize free elections pursuant to international standards, and we would like to share our ideas. Dear Belarusians, whilst the international community is shutting doors on the regime, the same doors are opening up for Belarus and for a new country that we are all building. Free and fair elections is key to new democratic Belarus. So let's create it together. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Svetlana. I now give the floor to Ms. Beata Matubilovich, who will be the moderator of the high-level panel. The first speaker will be, again, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Before that, I give the floor to
Many
Beata.
thanks, Alex, and many thanks to the partners who have participated in organizing this event. I thank you, everyone who is joining us today from around the world, for what I believe is going to be a very important conversation. Belarus is at a crossroads. As we see, there is continual societal demand for genuine and democratic elections in the country since the last presidential contest last August. As many of you know, no elections in Belarus have been found to meet international standards, according to observers. And this continues to be a pivotal issue since elections are envisaged as being a conflict resolution mechanism to change diverse interests and channel them through democratic structures. So it's with this in mind that we've brought together this eminent panel of individuals to discuss issues surrounding how such a process might serve as a dialogue for reducing and perhaps ameliorating tensions in the country. This panel will focus on the current state of affairs in Belarus, the origins of the crisis and its political and human rights dimensions. And speakers will also discuss why the current political crisis in Belarus matters from an international perspective and how it can be resolved through democratic means. Our first panelist, Ms. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who has just spoken, needs no introduction. And so without further ado, I pass the floor to her for her remarks on this important theme before continuing with the other panelists who I will introduce. Over to you, Ms. Tikhanovskaya.
Thank you, Beata. In my presentation, I will try to cover the questions. The recent events have shocked and rocked the world. Independent mass media still being prosecuted. As a result, Tudby was shut down. 2 more innocent people were killed. Plus, there is flagrant disregard for international flight rules, leading to unprecedented air piracy, state-sponsored. But all of these things is just a part of an all-absorbing crisis and impunity of the regime. And now this is a threat not only for 9.5 million people, but also for the rest of the world. And all these events are a result of yet another rigged election. EU citizens on board Ryanair had been hostages for 7 hours, and Belarusians had been hostages for about 27 years. The illegitimate regime is not accountable to its people, and as a result, it's dangerous for both Belarusians and the outside world because he decided to do everything in his power to stay in power. They think in short term. That's why there is an increasing pressure. And the concept of comprehensive security is enshrined by the OSCE, and I expect the OSCE to support us in looking for a crisis resolution. This is not just a challenge to Belarusians, this is an international challenge. Is there room for optimism in the short and long run, you're asking? I'd like to be optimistic, but we have to be realist as well. We opted for peaceful and democratic solution, which requires time and effort. But these solutions are correct ones. We need to hold democratic reform with long-lasting democratic impact. We cannot allow another authoritarian regime to come to power. The price we paid is too high already. So our people is a source of my optimism. They showed that they are invincible at the very start of this marathon, which seemed to be doomed to fail. Like I said, hundreds of thousands of Belarusians are supportive of the resolution, and preliminary consultations need to identify the subject matter of the negotiations as the first step. Resolutions of the current political crisis is a triple process. First, it's the reform of political system, restoration of the rule of law and human rights. Secondly, national dialogue and reconciliation based on release of all political prisoners and their rehabilitation. And thirdly, and this is the core, is new, free, fair, and just elections. OSCE could be a platform for preliminary negotiations. Some countries that have experience in this could be intermediaries, becoming guarantors of political stability, not only in Belarus, but elsewhere as well. Free and fair elections in Belarus is an instrument to resolve the crisis, because falsified election is the source of the crisis.
There is consensus on this issue, both inside the country and outside. The voices of Belarusians were stolen. Now, we must give them back to people. Tomorrow we'll discuss this process in detail, and for now, we'll be concentrating on the idea of the election. During the negotiations, we'll have to discuss who will hold the new presidential election. Since people don't trust the current CEC members, we'll have to launch and open a new one. As to the right for run in the election for candidates, will be following the electoral code and the constitution. The election will be held under international supervision and in line with international election standards. I will be welcoming all the local and international observers who would wish to come to Belarus. The existing legal base is another problem that we're trying to solve by developing the new rules and instructions. We need to have the opportunity to hold the free and fair election without the immediate amendments into the current electoral code, since time is very important for now. Here I will end my message. Please continue.
Спасибо большое, Svetlana. Thank you very much. And our next speaker, we have Ms. Clara Dobrev from the European Parliament. Clara is a Hungarian politician and vice president of the European Parliament. She holds a degree in economics from the Budapest University of Economics and also a law degree from Eötvös Loránd University of Arts and Sciences. She's held several governmental positions in the past, including as chief of cabinet to Mr. Péter Megdaszi during the 2001 to 2002 election, and also as vice president of the Office of National Development Plan and EU Support. In 2019, she was elected as a member of the European Parliament and subsequently elected as its vice president in July 2019. And it's with great pleasure that we welcome her to the event today. And I pass the floor to you, Ms. Dobrev.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Beata. Allow me to say a few words in Russian. Дорогие друзья, спасибо большое за приглашение.
Dear friends, thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to say a few words in Russian, since here in the European Parliament, in the European Union, we were watching with horror at the events happening in Belarus and Minsk in the last year and last moments. With whole heart, we're supporting you, Mr. Tikhanovskaya, and the democracy in Belarus. We'll be doing everything to help Belarus, so that millions of people who want freedom, who want democracy, they'll be able to live in the country where they're always important, not only Lukashenko.
Continue in English because, well, that's a little bit easier for me, but it was a great pleasure to hear and listen to you, Madam Tikhanovskaya, and again, from my whole heart, I really wish you success, and I would like to tell you that we in the European Union are doing everything what is possible in order to bring back Belarus to the European path and to the democratic path. Because, I mean, that's obvious. Lukashenko started to go towards North Korea. Everything what he is doing is in the same way. And millions of Belarusian people told him and telling him ongoing on the streets, in the media and everywhere that stop, it was enough, it's a nightmare and it must end. And today in this discussion, there are going to be a lot of experts, people who know a lot about election law, about constitution, how to organize and how to develop new pieces of legislation. So I'm definitely not the person who is going to say and tell you exactly what is the way to organize the new election and what is the way to organize the new constitution and the new way of the new democratic Belarus. But let me share you a few rather painful, actually, experiences and some thoughts, what maybe you should bear in mind. And I'm sharing this not only as a vice president of the European Parliament, but I'm sharing it with you as a Hungarian politician. And maybe this is something which is really important. First of all, is that whatever happens and however we can think about the new way, how the new democratic Belarus looks like, you should concentrate on institutions. Because, you know, individuals and people, they might go wrong. no matter how great women and men are entering the politics now, it's important to have a really rock solid institution. Let me share you a good example. President Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, well, he was really trying to build a strong power, an uncontrolled power. And he failed because the democratic institutions were strong enough. And a painful example, or a shameful even, I would say, a regretful one, is Hungary, where once a liberal Democrat, a young liberal Democrat, turned to the illiberal dictator, and the democratic institution of the Hungarian country and of Hungary were not strong enough. And definitely this is something what we have to learn from this lesson, that Belarus and Hungary as well, we need rock solid institutions. So when you are starting to design the new Belarus, you should always think of very strong institutional checks and balances. Second, I don't know when there's going to be election and a new constitution, but I know something for sure, that it will come. And our task in Europe and in Belarus and in the United States is to help this process to come as soon as possible. But whatever you design, a new electoral law, a new constitution, it's going to be great. It's going to be in consensus, and it's going to be a very good piece of legislation. But it's definitely not going to be perfect, because nothing is perfect. I can assure you that there's going to come, I'm sorry, just, hello? Yes. There's going to come someone who will say that, well, let's change it, let's make new rules, let's make new pieces of legislation just to adjust it as soon as possible to the new requirements. And my suggestion is, I'm sorry, I just have some connection problem. And my suggestion is that you should not, you should definitely not, and you should make it slowly. Don't do it in a hurry, because the stability of these pieces of legislation, the stability of the election law, the stability of the constitution, the stability of these core pieces of legislation, which creates a constitutional system in a country, it's more important than any rapid changes. So temptation to modify, you should resist it and maybe take your time and to have this double guaranteed consensus over a period. And the third one, and I think this is something what you are definitely learning now, defeating illiberal leaders. You can do it only in broad coalition. People coming from different backgrounds, political parties which in normal circumstances would compete among each other, because that's what democracy is about. And now they have to cooperate. And they have to build a coalition before election. And I know this is difficult. Sometimes you do not only have to make some political compromises, you have to make some personal compromises. There might be people who you like in the coalition, and there might be people who you don't really like. But the main goal is to bring back our people, our nation, to the democratic path, to the European future, is much more important than any differences before among us. So that's why I am a great supporter of a coalition, and after the election of a coalition government again. Living more than 10 years in an illiberal state makes me a big fan of coalition governments. Because, you know, in coalition you have a lot of debates, sometimes hot-tempered, but every single decision which is taken after a debate, even a hot-tempered debate, is better than a decision taken by a strong leader or a dictator or an autocrat. So definitely this is something what we have to learn when we are fighting illiberal dictators. And if you would allow me at the end to turn not only to the people of Belarus, but to the people in Europe, in the United States, as well. To protect democracy, it's not a domestic politics anymore, especially not in a globalized world. When we are trying to help Belarus people, when we are trying to help to restore after 27 years the democracy in Belarus, when we are trying and doing our best to help the opposition, then we are helping ourselves as well. Because democracy is something that you have to protect every day, even if you think that you are living in it. You know, Democrats who fall asleep and do not protect their democracies, they might wake up in dictatorship, because the political evil never sleeps, and we should protect ourselves. And that's a reason, a plus reason to help Belarus and to help you. And thank you very much again for inviting me to this conference. И я желаю вам успеха.
I wish you all the success. You can always rely on me. I will do everything possible for you to succeed in Belarus, to build a democratic country, democratic state in Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dobrev, and especially for that focus in democratic institutions, which is really crucial. And I'd just like to add that Ms. Dobrev is now a candidate for the Prime Minister position in Hungary, and so we'll be watching that with great anticipation. Our next panelist is replacing for Congressman Bill Keating, who could unfortunately not make it. And so it's my pleasure to have next Ms. Courtney Austrian, who is Chargé d'Affaires at the US Mission for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. She is a 25-year veteran of the US Diplomatic Corps and a member of the Senior Foreign Service. She arrived in Vienna to serve as the Deputy Chief of Mission in August 2020. But before that, she had also been on various overseas postings, including in Georgia, Ukraine, Russia, Syria, and Haiti. She has received her BA from Swarthmore College and an MBA in Public and Nonprofit Administration from Boston University, as well as an MS in National Security Strategy from the National War College. So I pass the floor over to you, Ms. Austrian.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to join you this afternoon. As I am a somewhat last-minute replacement, I will probably be a little bit briefer than I would otherwise be, but I can assure you that the United States support for the people of Belarus is consistent and is strongly expressed on a regular basis, both in Washington and around the world. And we, as a government, continue to be amazed by the strength, the resilience, and the courage of the Belarusian people as they demand to have their voices heard. And in the face of the rising repression, they have continued this very active and vibrant movement, and they have our full support. Speaking personally, as you alluded to, I am at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and I can assure you that the Belarusian cause comes up on a regular basis in our permanent council meetings, and is something that we speak to on a regular basis, and continue to really shine the spotlight on the activities of the regime there, and also on the very brave people who are working to affect change. And one of the things that we have done here at the OSCE was we launched the Moscow mechanism, and the United States was very proud to be one of a large number of countries that was behind the instigation of the Moscow mechanism, which really did go in and take a very close look at the repressive measures that the regime employed, particularly in the elections last year. And we very much welcomed the expert report that Professor Benedict published following a very, very intense investigation. But that report also provides a roadmap for reforms, and it gives a really good sense as to what opportunities exist. And it is unfortunate that the Lukashenko regime has not actually engaged with the OSCE, has not engaged with that report. The OSCE has really expressed a great deal of willingness and interest in working with the Belarusian people to try to find some kind of resolution. And I think that I can say that we continue to really work to try to make that possible. And here in Vienna, as well as in capitals around the world, we work with our partners on a regular basis. So we're very proud to support the International Accountability Platform from Belarus, which provides a mechanism for further actions that can be taken. And it allows the UN OHCR the resources that it needs in order to hold people to account. And in closing, really all I want to say is that we're really very committed to close coordination. And this is something that is in the United States. It's not one side of the aisle or the other. Republicans and Democrats alike are very focused on what is happening in Belarus. We support, the United States supports international efforts to independently look into the human rights abuses, the crackdown. We support free and fair elections. And we stand with the Belarusian people and their aspirations for a democratic, prosperous future. And events such as the Ryanair diversion of last week, I was trying to find the right word. These are provocative, they are not helpful, and we really do seek to find some democratic and appropriate solution. And so I'm sorry that you got stuck with me and not the congressman today, but I'm very passionate about this subject, and I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to join you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Austrian, and we really appreciate you coming in to speak today, and the role of the OSCE and its continued focus on the Belarusian situation, as well as the particular focus from the US delegation, has been noted over many years, and so that I think also contributes to a dialogue and to possible solutions. Thank you very much for speaking. Our next speaker on the list is Mr. Roberto Montella. He has assumed his duties as Secretary General of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in 2016 and was re-elected recently for a second 5-year mandate starting on the 1st of January 2021. Mr. Montella previously served as in the International Secretariat of the OSCPA as the Director of the Presidential Administration, and he's held positions at OSCE field missions in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro, as well as a range of advisory, peace building, and management functions. He's also served as the head of the OSCE South Serbia Regional Office and the head of the European Center for Minority Issues in Kosovo. Mr. Montella has taken part in dozens of election observation missions in the OSCE area and in the Middle East, and he's also served as coordinator of the long-term observers for the Carter Center. He served as political advisor to an Italian senator and to the PACE vice president, among other advisory roles that he's held. So over to you, Mr. Montella.
Thank you very much, Beata. You have reminded me of my CV, which sometimes I forget. Thank you very much to inviting me to this conference, and I also want to greet Ms. Tikhanovskaya, Svetlana, and Vice President Dobrev, dear Clara. We had good meetings in Brussels recently, and thank you for the words you have expressed in this conference. Thank you very much for inviting me to address the opening panel of this conference. As the Secretary General of the Parliamentary Assembly that counts Belarus as a member, and that is particularly active in election observation activities, I'm particularly glad to be with you today and to highlight the international perspective coming from a body that was created to build bridges and provide an effective platform for dialogue. In the name of shared values and commitments, the OSCPA is a friend of Belarus, and we always remember the exceptional hospitality that the Belarusian authorities put together for us in our annual session in 2017 in Minsk. And if one considers what has happened since last summer, I would maybe advise, or maybe we can circulate in this chat, to go back and listen to the opening remarks that President Lukashenko made at our annual session in Minsk, and the content of that presentation, and to look at it through the perspective of what has happened in the last months, it's very telling, I must say. It is unfortunate that there are no representatives of the Belarusian authorities here. I was hoping to see my dear friend and colleague Andriy Savitnik, the head of the Belarus delegation, and I understand they have been invited. I was hoping to discuss also with them and all together, and also use this event today to renew our commitment towards Belarus and reiterate once again our Assembly's readiness to support Belarus overcome these challenging times. I agree that election reform could serve to build confidence between all stakeholders, with past recommendations offered by the OSCE ODIHR, offering a ready and available roadmap. I also share the difficulties in how to define the episode of the Ryanair flight. I'll just say the Ryanair flight has generated a level of uncertainty on what could be next expected. This should be kept in mind in the elaboration and the implementation of new policies towards Belarus, both at the multilateral and bilateral level. Our Assembly, for instance, in its repeated attempts to offer a lending hand, has always prioritized an all-inclusive approach based on a corporate OSCE sense of collective responsibility and accountability. I have spared no efforts, and you know that, in trying to breed and perpetrate this approach within our Assembly, and it is exactly this very spirit which brings me today to this conference. Our Assembly has produced many innovative ideas and proposals aimed at helping resolve the crisis, not least through the promotion of dialogue with all, and I underline all sides involved. We have never compromised on serious violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and we will continue to do so. Our MPs, by definition and practice, represent people, and consequently, they stand for their rights and freedoms. This is the specificity and also the added value of our Assembly, the combination of strategic policy, the use of interparliamentary and intraparliamentary assembly, the use of channels of dialogue, and most importantly, the rights of the more than 1 billion people we serve. We will continue also through our very attentive Human Rights Committee to define the rights of the same people that our MPs represent. Now, this conference is about elections, so let me come to elections, which are the overarching topic. Simply put, one cannot speak about democratic solutions without elections, even if, of course, we should also not equate an election with democracy. It is not sufficient. Nevertheless, early elections are sometimes a solution for resolving a political crisis. This is also one of the several other recommendations by the OSCE Moscow Mechanism rapporteur, Wolfram Benedek, who was quoted earlier. But how can election be effective? To be effective, new elections would have to meet OSCE and international standards and be observed by the OSCE, which was unfortunately not the case in the last 2020 elections. Belarus has held many elections over the years. I was myself in Belarus in 2010 observing the elections in a team with President Tokayev, who was at that time the Vice President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. So I've seen how elections are conducted in Belarus. But OSCE observer missions have consistently found significant failings in these processes. Our missions are not intended to criticize, but aim to contribute to democratic development. Our work is carefully grounded in the commitments that all OSCE countries, including Belarus, have made in the 1990 Copenhagen document. We assess compliance on the basis of these clear criteria, holding countries to the commitments they have themselves freely have already agreed on. As a result of previous OSCE observer missions over the past several decades, as already mentioned previously, there is a clear set of recommendations which, if implemented, can significantly improve the electoral process. I will not pretend that the road ahead is easy, but at least these recommendations give a roadmap of the direction to go. The question, as it is often the case, relates to political will to implement those. It is not for me to say, but these recommendations already put forward by respected international organizations, which Belarusian authorities have long participated in, could form a useful basis for discussion among opposing groups. Finding common ground on democratic improvements would be a clear demonstration that parties are working on behalf of the entire people of Belarus. Needless to say that we will continue in the future to contribute to electoral support, including through observation. Our Assembly stands ready to support Belarus in overhauling its electoral legislation, implementing other important reforms, but also in calling for confidence-building measures and promoting dialogue. Dialogue is indeed the key word here. It is always the key word. The most effective and long-lasting solutions are always reached through dialogue. I have worked, as Beata mentioned, for many years in Southeast Europe, trying to be a build-bridger between opposing sides. And I'm a strong believer that if you have a honest dialogue and you engage honestly with those you have a disagreement with, we can find a common solution. It can be harsh dialogue sometimes, no doubt, but if there is goodwill to work for the people, it will ultimately conduct to a positive outcome. So this is to sum up my plea to all of you, to all sides in Belarus, including those who have decided not to attend today, that you are part of the same great country. So come together at the same table, and the OSCE and the rest of the international community stands ready to support you. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto, for stressing that importance of dialogue and the continued engagement with Belarus and with the Belarusian authorities. As you mentioned, this was envisaged as an open, transparent event, which is being broadcast to the world. And there was an open invitation to various members from the Belarusian government and from the authorities there. So it's quite a shame that we can't have that dialogue in the way that was envisaged, but we very much welcome having a discussion which is open and which is inclusive of all sides. And I think that's very crucial to any kind of forward thinking in terms of how elections can be held, which would be in line with international standards. And as Roberto has mentioned, international observers have noted past problems with that regard. Our next speaker is Mr. Kevin Casa Zamora, who is Secretary General of International IDEA since August 2019. Mr. Casa Zamora has more than 25 years of experience in democratic governance, focused on electoral systems and democratic institutions, as well as practical experience at a high level as a public official in his home country, as well as multilateral organizations. Until recently, he was a member of Costa Rica's Presidential Commission for State Reform, and also a managing director at Analítica Consultores. Previously, he was Costa Rica's second vice president and Minister of National Planning, and also Secretary for Political Affairs at the Organization for American States, as well as other key roles in other institutions. Mr. Casa Zamora holds a law degree from the University of Costa Rica, a master's in government from the University of Essex, and a PhD in political science from the University of Oxford. He has authored several studies on campaign finance, elections, democratization, citizen security, and civil-military relations in Latin America. So in his address, Mr. Casa Zamora will be looking at two particular questions in our program, namely, why has the goal of new elections as the output of negotiations been supported internationally, and what aspects of holding new elections should be agreed upon during any negotiations? So the floor is yours, Kevin, please.
Thank you so much, Beata, for the kind introduction. Before I start answering your questions, please allow me to say how glad I am that this discussion is taking place. It is immensely important and timely, both for Belarus, but also for democratic forces around the world. I'm truly honored that International IDEA is working together with the pro-democracy camp in Belarus and is coordinating this event alongside our friends at IFES and DRI. And I would also like to express my compliments, gratitude, and respect for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her team. You have become the symbol of hope and change for millions of people, both within and outside of Belarus, who want to see a democratic future in your country. And both I and all of International IDEA staff and our 33 member states stand ready to support you and all the democratic forces in Belarus on this journey. to the question, why has the goal of new elections as the output of eventual negotiations been supported internationally? Well, there's a short and there's a long answer to that question. The short answer is simply that this is a goal that needs to be supported because the last election was neither fair, free, or credible. And rather than a testament of democracy, it was a testament of dictatorial desperation and of a regime that is prepared to beat, maim, imprison, and kill its citizens just to stay in power. And mind you, the last elections were certainly the visible trigger to the current impasse, but in fact, they were no more than the culmination of decades of undemocratic elections, repression, and intimidation. So that's the short answer. The longer answer, and this has been mentioned here already, the longer answer has to do with the truly foundational role that free and fair elections have in the making of a new democratic settlement. For any country, properly managed and conducted elections provide the only sound basis for an orderly transition of power and a legitimate political arrangement. And it is only through properly managed and conducted elections that one of the true virtues of democracy, namely its inherent ability to correct its course of action and changing those in power, it can come to life. But what do we mean when we say properly managed and conducted elections? Simply put, we mean elections where all citizens can freely and safely express their views on who should represent them and their votes are taken into account, where freedom of expression, of assembly, and of the press is guaranteed, where repression of or intimidation against the opposition, media, or civil society are not tolerated, where independent observers are allowed to scrutinize the process, where electoral disputes can be resolved by independent courts, and most of all, where incumbents hand over power when defeated. These are the elements that form the type of elections all countries, including Belarus, but also existing democracies, should strive for. And in the case of Belarus, we all know that none of these conditions were met during the last election or the ones before. Through regressive constitutional and legislative changes since the mid-90s, Belarus's electoral management institutions can no longer be considered independent. The president of Belarus looms over the entire electoral process. You asked me why the international community supports the idea of new elections. Well, first of all, because the alternatives are too awful to contemplate. The alternatives are the status quo or a violent rupture of it. And as in so many other cases, new credible elections offer the best peaceful route to a new political settlement that is legitimate, representative, and hopefully stable. The role of the international community in promoting and technically supporting national authorities to hold elections in line with internationally agreed standards goes back at least 20 years. But in the case of Belarus, a meaningful reform has never been implemented or even attempted. If we, the international democratic community who go around saying that we defend and promote democracy worldwide, shy away from supporting Belarus in this critical time with organizing new elections, then we would be making a conscious decision to corner the Belarusian people into two awful alternatives. Either acquiescence in the face of authoritarian, vile, and corrupt rule, or violence. But I would add that there's another crucial reason why the democratic forces in Belarus obviously deserve our support. Because in this time of democratic skepticism and lack of self-confidence, when so many voices out there are sowing doubts about the future of democracy, when so many voices out there are embracing the mirage of authoritarian efficacy, people in Belarus, as in Hong Kong, are reminding us that the demand for democracy is alive and kicking. That liberal democracy is not a geopolitical imposition of a cabal of wealthy North Atlantic countries, but that it actually speaks to profound needs in human nature felt across cultures. Belarus, after all, is not a destitute country where people are going out on the streets against the government because they're starving. They're demonstrating by the millions because, as French writer Antoine de Saint-Exupéry is supposed to have said, humankind is not merely a herd that expects to be fed. That's the key argument in favor of democracy. It is the only political system that treats us as something more than underage dupes in need of tutelage. And in doing so, is the only political system that respects our inherent dignity as human beings. That's what the brave people in Belarus are reminding us of today, and I thank them for that. And perhaps I could go into what I think are the conditions that should be agreed upon during negotiations in order to hold credible elections in Belarus. Perhaps I could go into that during the Q&A. So I'll leave it at that for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and especially for focusing on those fundamental rights issues and the importance of democratic institutions in solving possible conflict and in leading to negotiations and possible settlement. So with that, we will now open the floor to questions and answers from the audience. And we already have one from a journalist in Ukraine, Ms. Natalia Karchenko. And she wants to thank the participants for an insightful discussions, but asks whether you could please share your opinion on what the key problems Belarus may face at the first stage of preparation for early elections, and also what solutions to these problems or challenges can you suggest in order to defend democracy? So I was thinking perhaps Ms. Clara and Courtney can look at the political challenges, and maybe Mr. Roberto and Kevin can also look at the electoral issues, but I turn the floor over to who would like to go first. Clara, would you like to maybe start? And I think you're muted.
I don't know whether I've heard everything because I had some problems with the election, but the question was what can Belarus face in the upcoming months? That was the key second part of the question, what I got.
Key problems that they may face at the first stages of preparations and what solutions might be proposed to defend democracy.
Yes. Well, as you know, immediately the European Parliament suggested sanctions against the regime of Lukashenko, and we are going on in this path, and we are not going to let down the people of Belarus. I'm responsible for the so-called Euronest program of the European Union, and Belarus actually should be one of the countries participating in this program, but we are not going to allow them to take part in this program anymore. This is actually, it's not only about knowledge transfer, it's not only about cooperation, it's about financial support as well to important projects in the Euronest countries, and the government of Lukashenko is simply not validated to distribute any funds on behalf of the European Union. I think this would be very important together with our allies, finally I can say again, in the United States, to make a very strict and concrete program and to coordinate our next steps against the Lukashenko regime. And we always have to watch toward Russia as well to see whether President Putin has plans with Belarus. What is he trying to do? And we have exactly because of that way to join our forces, Europe and the United States, to force the Belarus authorities to release the prisoners, to hold a new election, and put an enormous pressure on this, well, call it in the name, dictatorship.
Thank you, Clara. Ms. Austen, would you like to comment?
I think that one of the very first, you asked about elections, one of the very first components is a willingness and openness to dialogue, and looking at actually engaging and being willing to move forward. I don't know that it's a lack of knowledge or information. I think that, as Roberto discussed in his remarks, the ODIHR from OSCE is more than willing to assist in helping with elections. Within the United States, we have many different parts of our government, as well as nonprofit organizations that are also well positioned to be able to help in terms of staging democratic elections. As Clara discussed, there, of course, are issues related to disinformation that would also need to be addressed. But what it really requires is a willingness and an openness. And we encourage the Belarusian government to take advantage of the opportunities that have been made available to it. The OSCE chairperson in office, which is Sweden, has expressed frequent willingness to engage with the authorities in brokering a dialogue between the government, the so-called government, and the democratic those people who are pursuing democracy in Belarus, including Ms. Sikhanouskaya. This is not a new effort, but it does require a willingness to engage. And the OSCE is a wonderful place for that to take place, because we are all members of this organization. I sit across the table from my Belarusian colleague on a regular basis. We are able to talk to each other. So if we can't do it here, this is the place to do it.
Indeed, it is the place to do it, and that is the format for having these kinds of discussions. So thank you very much for those thoughts. Over to you, Roberto, for your input on this question.
Thank you very much, Beata. I actually just heard the representative of the US mission in Vienna. Finally, I can see you all, because I see myself on the screen. I find it difficult to talk to myself. Now I see your faces. I totally agree with what Austrian was saying. I mean, it's the first stumbling block here is the willingness of the authorities in Minsk to engage in a dialogue with the international community, and first and foremost with their opposition. If that doesn't take place, I mean, we can discuss on the modality of the electoral process, whether it's appropriate to change election laws 6 months before an election or not, or when a longer-term electoral reform should take place. There is the acquis, there is the OSCE recommendation. So the entire package is available. What is missing here is that on the one side, there is the authorities who say, no, we don't want to engage with the group that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya represents, but also with others. They say, I don't know if this is the case also in their penal code, but I mean, some of them are even accused as being terrorists. So we are the stumbling block. The authorities say no dialogue with the opposition. The international community saying, let's try to sit together and talk and give them a chance to represent their concerns. And we are ready to be a platform, not in a platform, especially in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. We are not here pointing fingers or accusing. We just, of course, underlining the defense of the shared values and commitments that Belarus has made. But we are ready to engage with the authorities. But if from that side there is a no to any kind of engagement with the international community, a total blockade with any connection with the opposition. We have tried, Svetlana was part of a panel with the head of the Belarus delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in September. They both presented their positions. There was a kind of a discussion, but that's, I think, to my knowledge, Svetlana will be able to clarify that. To my knowledge, is the last time that there was actually a face-to-face discussion with the Minsk authorities. And so if that doesn't happen, what are the tools that the international community has in order to foster a dialogue or move forward? I mean, there are tools that we know in the OSCE, the calling a country to respect its shared values and commitments, or what in diplomacy is called naming and shaming. There are other tools that are applied, like sanctions, bigger sanctions, smaller sanctions. We, OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, promote dialogue, but of course, dialogue requires two to tango. So once you have exhausted these tools of the international diplomacy, what are the other tools? I mean, there are more robust tools, but I mean, of course, we're not going to advocate more robust tools. So I do not know what, how you come out of this if not finding a way to ask the authorities in Minsk to make a beau geste and to kind of move forward. But what has happened recently, it's maybe giving me a more pessimistic, let's say, perspective. But I don't want to be the, I mean, normally trying to always bring a positive posture. So I would like to remain optimist, but I do not see much elements to remain optimist in this moment. And all our efforts, however noble they are, and you know, I am here representing also Belarus in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Some will say, why are you engaging with a side which we consider a terrorist side? You know, like, of course, I mean, I have no problem. I feel that it's appropriate and correct for me because I talk to all sides. But this is the starting position. So how we come out of this, if there is anybody clever here, I will very much want to learn that. Sorry to be too less official than what I was given to read, but I was told to be very sticking to my script, so I did. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Roberto. And I think it's exactly that question of what tools do we have to be able to, you know, create the societal dialogue that's necessary and has been necessary for some time. And it's exactly with that in mind that these discussions are taking place, and hopefully some interesting thoughts will come out of that. But thank you for highlighting that. Kevin, to you for your thoughts.
Sure, thank you. Beata, I think, you know, this is a good moment to reflect a little bit on the conditions that should be agreed upon during a process of dialogue in order to have credible elections. I mean, we've already talked at length about the need for elections to be part of any solution to the current impasse. So, but there are a number of conditions that need to be met. To start with, political repression has to stop, and political prisoners must be freed, and this should be non-negotiable. And moreover, the incumbent government must guarantee freedom of expression, of assembly, and of the press. And this is something that I want to insist on, because you know, in my part of the world where I come from, we've had these discussions around the case of Venezuela for a long time. And one of the points that has been raised repeatedly is that, yes, you know, there are two parties to this dialogue, two parties to this dispute, but they're not equivalent. The role of guaranteeing freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press falls squarely within the purview of the government. It is the government and only the government that needs to guarantee those things. So that's number one. Second, the country needs an independent electoral authority approved by both the opposition and the current government, and that enjoys public trust. Without that, no credible election is possible. Third, an inclusive and transparent process for preparing the first democratic elections need to be put in place, and with some haste, because there's a tight timeline of between 30 and 70 days, according to the Constitution. So at a minimum, that process must make sure that voter lists are publicly available and can be scrutinized by voters. That safeguards are introduced to protect the integrity of early voting, particularly if the election is held during the pandemic. That the transparency of the vote count is guaranteed, including by publishing the results at every polling station. And that an independent and efficient system of electoral dispute resolution is put in place. Fourth, and this has been mentioned already, credible international observers must be allowed to witness the elections. And this is one of the key elements for building trust, to build buy-in and international recognition of the outcome of the elections. And fifth, Belarus requires serious electoral reform, anchored, and this has been mentioned already, in the OSCE, ODIHR, and Venice Commission recommendations. The cornerstone of this reform must be protecting the independence of election management institutions. Given the very tight deadline to organize the election, this will be difficult to achieve before the election, but it needs to be agreed upon from the outset. And only such a legal and institutional reform can set the proper foundation for future democratic, free, and fair elections, and that can reflect the will of the people of Belarus. And this last point is key. It is vital to look beyond a single election and adopt measures that ensure democratic consolidation in the long term. I mean, we know from decades of experience with democratic transitions that an election is not a quick fix for becoming a democracy overnight. And particularly in countries that have experienced prolonged periods of authoritarian rule, democratic consolidation will play out over many, many electoral cycles. And the practical implication of this is that elections should not be seen as solutions to structural problems, but rather as instruments that contribute to broader transitional processes defined over time by principles of constitutionalism and the rule of law, by the operation of a variety of political parties, and by the presence of free media and a vibrant civil society. You know, these processes are very complex. And they also, by the way, involve very thorny issues of timing and sequencing, and also unpleasant choices. And that was mentioned before by Clara Dobrev in her remarks. And I think it's very wise that she mentioned this. And a particularly difficult but indispensable, often indispensable choice concerns the need to consider introducing amnesty and transitional justice arrangements. And this means, in short, that it might be necessary to offer incentives for those in government to secure a democratic and peaceful resolution and avert an escalation to the crisis. But it's very important to bear in mind that transitional arrangements should be time-bound and not become permanent. And I guess, and with this I finish, I mean, this speaks to a more general point. Democratic transitions are inherently messy. And decisions made at the initial stages can really cast a long shadow over the long-term prospects of a democracy. And unfortunately, the international experience in these matters is abundant. There is a lot to learn from all regions in the world, and we at International IDEA, we will be supporting the pro-democratic forces in Belarus every step of the way. I mean, to share and discuss those lessons from the international experience, but more generally, simply to support the people that are fighting the good fight for principles that are dear to all of us.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you specifically for mentioning those various technical aspects and the importance that they have in having genuine and democratic elections, but also the meaning that has in the bigger political context and the democratic picture. So thank you for your thoughtful responses on that. The next question we have from David Kramer at Florida International University, and he asks whether having free and fair elections in Belarus would inherently mean that Mr. Lukashenko would not be able to participate in them. So that's a question that he poses. And perhaps I'll turn now to Svetlana to comment on that question, as well as to any of the previous discussions that we've had and comments that have been made. So over to you, Svetlana. Пожалуйста.
Thank you very much, colleagues and friends. I would like to react in particular to several points that were mentioned here. Ms. Clara Dobrev said that we should particularly careful about development of democratic institutions. I fully support this view, and I believe it's much more important to make elections transparent and democratic than to vote to preview its results. Also, I believe that the creation of democratic institutions takes time, but it needs to be prompted. There should be an impulse in the face of new democratic elections. Ms. Austrian, I agree with you that Mr. Benedict's report prepared in the framework of the Moscow mechanism should play a major role, just like the OSCE in general, and I'm very, very grateful to you and your colleagues for the support of democratic ideals and support of Belarusians for their fight for free and fair election. Also, I would like to thank Mr. Mantella. We would like to thank you for being our friends. Thank you for your uncompromising position. We appreciate it a lot. We totally agree on the most important thing, that only through dialogue we'll be able to find solution to the current crisis. And I'm confident that the Parliamentary Assembly or the OSCE can play a very major role here in this dialogue. Mr. Casa Zamora, I also agree with you, of course, and I think this is a discussion of like-minded people today. I agree that the respect for basic freedoms like freedom of election, freedom of associations, freedom of media must be a foundation for the fair election. And for this, a political will is needed. Unfortunately, we haven't been witnessing such a will for a long time. And it happened we're facing this crisis not only because the last democratic election happened a long time ago, but also because people are running out of patience.
I think tomorrow we'll be able to have more exposure to the details about potential elections. All I can say for now is that it will not be simple, but there are enough world-level experts in Belarus to tackle this challenge. The question was posted about Lukashenko will be banned from next elections. All I can say here is that we need to stay within the boundaries of the law as we hold new elections.
Thank you very much, Svetlana, for that thoughtful answer and also responding to the other comments that have been made. And as you point out, many of these questions will be dived into deeper in the remaining sessions today and also tomorrow. So I very much encourage participants to stay on and to participate in those more detailed discussions. We have time for a few more questions. The next one is from a student who is studying politics and international relations in England. And she would like to know, what part do students in Belarus and surrounding areas have to play in creating a new and democratic constitution and democratic society? And how can it be ensured that this climate of fear is changed in favor of a more European style of democratic society in Belarus? So I don't know who would like to take the first stab at that question, but a very important one about the role of youth and young people in promoting democratic norms within societies. Maybe Svetlana, if you would like to.
I think we're all aware that students are a future of Belarus, and the part that students will play is evident because so many students flooded the streets in post-election Belarus. Many students showed their will, many got expelled over this. The students that had to leave, I'm sure, are aware that there is no place like home, and they desire to come back. And I call upon students, study well, so that you will be able to put to good use your experience and knowledge for the benefit of Belarus. And what was the second question, Beata?
Yes, sorry about that. The second was, how can the climate of fear that's currently existing be changed out in favor of a more European style of participation?
Мы сейчас говорим о страхе внутри Беларуси, правильно я понимаю?
We're talking about fear inside Belarus, yes. You know, people are frightful, very much. So, but there is another feeling, more encompassing, more absorbing than fear. It's anger. It's anger at seeing how fellow citizens are getting treated, how they're getting tortured, how they're driven to suicide. This is a sheer nightmare. And this anger translates into energy that will compel people to keep on fighting for new elections, for a democratic future. I'm positive that having gone through this gauntlet of throes at the hand of this terrible regime, Belarusians will be quick in transforming this energy into democratic vein. And it will not be a long time before, sorry, I'm looking for the right word. I got up at 4 a.m. So it won't be a long time before we will get to democratic principles. We will achieve democratic principles in relations
Thank
and
you very
interactions.
much. And I think it's particularly important to channel those forces in a constructive direction. And as you say, harness the energy that this kind of process brings to allow people, and especially young people, to be able to engage in their societies and engage in their processes rather than become distant from them or in some way not feel that this is part of their solution. We have 5 minutes remaining in this panel, so I thought it would be good for each of the panelists to maybe make a few last comments or any points that they would like to highlight. And perhaps we could go in reverse order, starting with Kevin on his final thoughts for this panel. Please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Beata. I'll simply say that we stand solidly shoulder to shoulder with the pro-democracy forces in Belarus. I think it's their struggle is the relevance of their struggle goes well beyond Belarus. It's a struggle that is important for democratic forces around the world. You're fighting the good fight at a moment where, you know, when many people are skeptical about the future of democracy. So your struggle has a broader meaning to the world, and we are here to support it, and to support it also with in many different ways, including providing the technical assistance necessary to organize credible elections, which inevitably should be part of a new democratic dawn for Belarus. So, by all means, count us in, and we are here to be part of this struggle. So, I'm very proud that we are having this discussion and to be able to convene this conversation at this critical time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. The importance of democracy globally. Over to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Beata. One of the first acts as Secretary General when I was elected in 2016 was to speak to Viktor Guminsky, who is now the Deputy Secretary General of the CIS. He was at that time the head of the Belarus delegation. And I asked him to organize the annual session in Belarus. He came back to me after 1 week, said, of course, we will be ready to organize an annual session in 2017. It was very difficult for me as a newly elected Secretary General to also explain to the rest of the OSCE participating states why we would go to Belarus. There were challenges in Belarus. There were reports from the OSCE, their missions, that things were not going too well. So they say, why do you go there and do this? And we spoke at length with the authorities in Minsk and said, look, we would like to do an annual session. It's a sign of respect and recognition to your authorities and to your country, but we would like you to engage in civil society. They let a big forum for civil society NGOs meet the day before the annual session met. Then there was a great speech, in my opinion, of President Lukashenko at our opening plenary, and I will circulate this speech later on. We would hope at that time that this was the beginning of an ouverture, let's say, of Belarus authorities towards the things that the OSCE stands for. I must say, unfortunately, the situation as it is now is very far from what it was in 2017. So my concluding remarks would be to appeal to all of those who were our partners in the lead up to the annual session, with whom we engaged, and we created also personal rapport, to say to them, please go back to where we were, try to engage your opposition, try to talk to your people, try to to open up the doors. There are no enemies here. There is nobody who has any prejudice. There are just people who stand for values, the values of this organization. But we would like you to open up the doors and engage the OSCE. And we would like to ask you to engage the representatives of your civil society, the representatives of your political parties, those who have competed in the presidential elections like Svetlana, and all those who represent other segments of the Belarusian society other than the presidential administration. So that's my message. Open the door and talk to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Over to you, Ms. Austrian, for your final thoughts.
Thank you so much. I'd like to continue with what I started with, which is the United States stands with the Belarusian people in their aspirations for a democratic and a prosperous future. And we support the call of the people for the regime to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this is support for media freedom. This is support for freedom of assembly. And this is support for freedom of speech and for self-determination. And so the United States is looking at all of the tools that we have available to support the Belarusian people's democratic aspirations. And I did see a question that was lower in the chat that referred to sanctions. And I think if you look from the White House just last week, the White House announced that the U.S. Treasury Department is going to be developing a new executive order that will provide the United States the ability to impose additional sanctions on the Lukashenko regime and its support network and those that support the corruption and the abuse of human rights and the attacks on democracy. So this is not a struggle that has come to an end, and we stand with the Belarusian people.
Thank you very much for that, Courtney. And Ms. Clara Dobrev is, while we're discussing elections on the campaign trail, so had to drop off, but I'm sure that she will follow this discussion. And so the final word to Ms. Tikhanovskaya on any last thoughts that she would like to convey.
I'd like to thank everyone who attended this conference. It's very important for Belarusian people. Special thanks go to Alexander Schlick and to Beata for the moderation. I want to thank all the participants for your time for discussing new elections in Belarus, and I hope tomorrow will be no less productive. Such conferences is a good start leading to new election. Thank you for sharing part of yourself so that everything works out here.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. Thank you very much to all the panelists and to all of those who have joined in today. Спасибо вам всем огромное, and the discussions will continue now on to the second panel and tomorrow in the second day on various short-term and long-term possible solutions to electoral reform and continued dialogue. So with that, I close and I hand over back to Alexander Schlick. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beata. Thank you for the wonderful moderation. Большое спасибо, Beata, за идеальное проведение этой панели высокого уровня.
Thank you, Beata, for perfect moderation. We will not make a break and go straight to the next panel. I'd like to give the floor to the next moderator. So without further ado, we have about 80 attendees, and there were a couple hundred people watching us on YouTube. Let me remind you that we are recording this, and the recording will become available later on YouTube. So, Michael, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for the handover. I hope you can all hear me well. I wish you a good afternoon in Minsk, in Warsaw, Berlin, or wherever you're watching from, and a good morning for those who are in the United States. It's my honor to speak here. I'm very glad that we can be part of this event by the Coordination Council by the team of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, to explore some of these more institutional questions in more detail. I will do as Beata did before and introduce the speakers here before I hand the floor to them. Before doing that, just maybe a few thoughts from my side. My name is Michael Meyer-Resende. I represent Democracy Reporting International. It's an NGO based in Berlin. We have offices in many countries. We have an office in Ukraine, for example, and worked for many years also in all parts of the OSCE inside the EU as well. And I was encouraged by what Clara Dobrev said about institutions, because that very much represents our idea or the focus of our organization in terms of supporting democracy, which is strengthening of institutions. There is an interesting connection, I think, between social mobilization and the creation of institutions. And I would quote the founder of the European Union, one of the founders, Jean Monnet, who said that change is made by people, but change is maintained by institutions. And I think this is very important in all discussion of democratization, that you have a moment of mobilization. At some point, it has to translate into institutions to be durable and to stick. And that's what we try to work on. And with this in mind, we have in the last month held various meetings with partners, in particular with the European Partnership for Democratic Elections, to look at various institutional aspects of the situation in Belarus, be it constitutional reforms or elections, together with many good experts from Belarus. I would share three thoughts for this panel now. I think the one question one has to answer head on is, why are we doing this? Where is the opening for elections? Many people don't see it now, and I can understand that sentiment. I've worked for more than 20 years in political transitions, and they are very unpredictable. There are often situations where you think it's totally hopeless, and suddenly something changes. And I think that's one point to keep in mind. And I think it's extremely important to have a very good level of preparedness. And I know many of the people in the panel today work tirelessly to be prepared for a moment where the voice of Belarusians is heard again, and to prepare that moment and not to be wrong-footed, if you want. So that's, I think, one merit of the discussion we have today. Second merit is actually the person who is not in the call. There was an invitation to representatives of the Belarusian government, where I'm not too surprised that they didn't accept, but I think it's very important to signal that, of course, these events and these exchanges are nothing secret. They're not behind closed doors. They're there for everybody. And there may be many people actually working in the administration of Belarus who don't dare, are not allowed simply to attend here, but they may listen. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there may be many people who would love to work for that kind of transition, but they don't have the possibility to do so now. And the third observation is that we speak a lot about fear and anger, and I fully understand this, and I share that if we look at the developments in Belarus, in particular, since August last year. But I think what you do, the people who are here on the panel, shows us something different also. It's the opposite of fear, it's confidence. The Coordination Council sits here confidently with many international interlocutors, discusses the ideas, discusses them in transparency, and has a dialogue about them. And we see time and again that in dictatorships and very closed regimes, there's no such courage. There's no open debate. There's no discussion. There's just hiding and lying and pretending. And I think in this way, also this panel should show us a good Belarus, a confident Belarus with very good expertise that gets out there and discusses ideas and what it's doing. And that's what we all do in Europe. All our governments in discussions, international discussions, explaining and listening to what others have to say. And with these introductory remarks, I would turn to the first speaker, and I hope we can manage this panel well with the 3 languages. I hope I'm not speaking too fast for the translators. And I would start by asking all of you to tell us in 5 minutes, where do you see the situation now? Yeah, it's different than 3 months ago and different than 6 months ago. And what would it mean for elections where we are now? How do we get from what was discussed in the previous panel deeper into what does all this mean now for a possible electoral process? And that would be the introduction, and then we go deeper into these questions. And I would first invite, following the agenda here, Franak Viatchorka. I think he is known to many of you. He is an activist, he is a journalist, he worked for Belsa TV and for Radio Free Europe, and he's a senior advisor to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and has, I think, gained a lot of visibility in this role and helped a lot to explain developments in Belarus in the last 12 months. And so, Franak, I give you the floor to explain us where do you see things standing and what would that mean? Where do we are in relation to possible elections? You have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this conference. Congratulations to Alex Schlick and also to my colleagues on this panel. I must say that we are now in the beginning of the third wave of Belarus uprising or revolution. So everything started before presidential elections last year, when three leading forces united and three female politicians took a picture, actually, and many things started with this picture because it was demonstration of the unity of democratic forces, but also of the willingness of the society to change the paradigm. The second wave was after elections, when elections were rigged, and elections became the critical point in this uprising, because people clearly demonstrated that the elections, that they want changes. They voted for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. They managed to prove they voted for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya because of many technologies that that helped to show the contrast between those supporting the regime and those supporting the democratic movement. I was just, I received from Alex Schlick the message that I can speak Belarusian language. Я могу говорить по-белорусски? Подтвердите, коли ласка.
Yes, we have translation. You can speak in any of the three languages.
Добре, тоді я перейду.
Then I will switch to
Right,
the
and I
Belarusian
switched
language.
to Belarusian.
So, on the 9th of August, Belarusians showed that they stand for changes. It was manifested by the program GOLOS, and there were fixation centers of rigging by Zuber Media and others, and they went to the streets to defend their vote. After that, the topic of protest widened. Besides the election rigging, people started protesting again they started to protest for dignity, because they came across torture and repressions. And the third wave of protest, the previous two were started by the regime, but the third wave is taking a new stage, and the Belarusians understood that the two first waves created the ground for the third wave, which is peaceful resistance. The new wave is not possible without building new alternative structures that would lay foundations for a new democratic society, and they are impossible without the international community. In any way, international participation is badly needed. Assistance during the transition. The organization is also about the temporary institutions of power for holding such elections, and also for observing and monitoring such elections, for these elections to be fair and to be accepted by all parties. Now we see that the regime, which indirectly recognizes all its crimes while diverting the plane, while the repressing of the activists, they are indirect signs of uncertainty of the regime. But on the other hand, we tend our hand of help. You who are on the other side, you are Belarusians. Let's all together tackle this crisis. This crisis we can only tackle with the help of new elections and via negotiations. It is very important not to to understand first the reconciliation, and on the other hand the justice. Those who committed crimes should be punished, but on the other side we should do everything for the society not to split the society even more, for the elections to unite the society that was split by the regime following the last election. Well, we have a legitimacy crisis, a vacuum of legitimacy. The authority, the person that has legitimacy is outside those, but the government, the authority that has the control over the law enforcement, they don't have the legitimacy, they do not have support of the majority of people. So the solution here is to have negotiations and to renew this legitimacy by the way of elections that should be supported by the Belarusian society and also by the international community. Once again, I'm sure that elections are possible this year, and well, our headquarters and Alexander Slik developed idea and prepared everything that we could do them within 1 month and a half, and all parties are interested in having such elections.
Thank you very much. I was just hesitating to listen to the end of the translation. That will happen occasionally, so don't think I lost you or something. Thank you very much, Frana Kaverkova, also for sticking to the time and to referring to the important groundwork that has been done by Alexander Schlick and his colleagues, and which we will discuss in more detail tomorrow. I'm now happy to invite the next panelist, Olga Kaverkova. She is a trained lawyer. She is an activist. She is a member of the board of the Christian Democrats. She had been detained already last year and had to leave the country, like all of you, as far as I'm aware. And she's also in the presidium of the Coordination Council. So, Olga, you have the floor. Please let us know, also in 5 minutes or so, your thoughts about the current situation and how it could evolve towards elections.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for organizing this event. I would like to thank the colleagues for taking part in this discussion. It's important. Can you hear me? It's important to say that after the election, it is the repression and the release of political prisoners that remain major issues. If we look at the 9 months since August, the situation, we haven't reached any results, major results and outbreaks here. Belarusians continue demanding the possibility to govern the country. What is the current state of the Belarusian society? When people do not choose the representatives in the power bodies, there appears a huge gap, because what the people in power do is not in line to what citizens want. It breaks the system. Basically, the regime is damaging, destroying the Belarusian state, and current situation is very much threatening to the whole country, because paying the loans on the foreign internal debts will be done. This will be done only by Belarusians, but also the people in power who can now influence the system. It is this state official can and must force the regime to stop it, because dialogue is not only about stopping repressions, and this is not a weakness, it's an act of force. Also, I would like to focus that on the fact that today is 2021, and in current conditions, the new elections are on a table, because first, the necessary condition for them is the very strong position towards Russia, and particularly that of the United States, because the current regime is very much supported by the regime of Putin. And in this situation, when the Belarusian authorities are getting political and financial support, they will not agree to the new election, because they will lose. Any EU sanctions are limited in their coverage, because they can be compensated by Russia, by, for example, redirecting shipments through Russia. This way, the influence of Russia on Belarus needs to be neutralized. It could be done by EU and US. The fact that President Biden will talk about Belarus with Russia is right, but only if he is tough on Putin. And basically, we're witnessing that in many ways, democracy is cannot do much about the Belarusian authoritarian regime. Belarusian's regime is so tough because a lot has been forgiven to it. Remember, Belarusian government and Belarusian judges who were put on the lists on list of persons banned to enter the EU. Then they were taken off those lists, and I see that authoritarians all over the world feel themselves quite fine. Let's say in China, many Uyghurs are in concentration camps, and doesn't prevent to do business with the Chinese companies. Russia waged war in Georgia, but Obama pressed the button on reload. Then was Donbass, then was Crimea. We need to understand the approaches to the authoritarian regimes must be reviewed, because authoritarianism is not all about Belarus alone. While if we do not take the international context out of the picture, then we have a chance of building democracy in Belarus. We need to understand that the fight for democracy is a serious global issue, which the humanity is facing all over the world. A new fair election needs to be held after the repression stop. The political prisoners released, and political leaders that are away in enforced migration will be able to come back. And also the role of the OSCE is major here. We need to also use the rule of law.
Thank you, Olga, for also looking a little bit at the bigger international and, if you want, geostrategic context, which we all know plays a big role also in this whole crisis. I would then turn to Pavel Latushka. Pavel Latushka is a graduate of the law faculty, and he's a former Belarusian diplomat. You have been ambassador to Poland, to France, to Spain and Portugal. You have also served as a Minister of Culture, and in your last official position, I understand, as a director of the National Academic Theatre, and you were forced to resign from there. And you're also a member of the Presidium of the Coordination Council and also the head of the National Anti-Crisis Management. And we are very interested also, of course, in your views and thoughts on where we are now and how we could get to elections from here, or what kind of scenarios could unfold that would open that door. Mr. Latushka, I give you the floor.
Добрый день, уважаемые участники конференции.
Good afternoon, distinguished participants of the conference. First of all, I'd like to thank Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and Alexander Shlik, who is a very experienced professional and expert on election topic, for organizing this event. Talking today about the future elections is difficult, but it is necessary. Why? Because the current events linked to another event, suicide committed by Stepan Latipov in the courthouse when the authorities were almost giving him a political sentence, passed political sentence on him. This shows that elections as a solution out of this crisis is what it's very important to talk about this, but I support Olga Kaverkova in saying that it's important to understand how to reach this point. Again, on the agenda, we have an issue about how we can achieve the new standards, democratic standards, and I'm talking from the position of the People's Democratic Movement. We believe that we must mobilize Belarusian society, people, those living inside Belarus and outside Belarus. If we think that this is the main approach, then we need to conduct the following actions. First and foremost, we need to put pressure inside the country. We need to mobilize the assets in Belarus and human resources. And there was a plan presented by Paul, and it presupposes the formation of the structures, non-public structures, but peaceful ones, irrespective of the professional background and social groups. We need to have this group of people that will be used in order to show the massive people's protest that people disagree with what the current usurper is doing. Next element is sanctions. Unfortunately, I must state that we're disappointed in the policy of the EU over the last 9 months, even though we have many times during our conversations with the representatives of the foreign ministries, MPs, and other powerful forces in many countries, and here I mean the political anti-crisis movement. We many times said that only the tough sanctions can stop the wave of large scale, of the biggest repressions in Europe over the last 40 years. We were not heard by the European politicians, and it was the incident with the Ryanair plane that ended in another political statement. I am afraid that the political statement made by last week by the heads of the European governments, particularly the leading countries like Germany, France, basically all of them, I'm afraid that no actions will follow, no real actions will follow those statements. Here I'm based on the experience of communicating with European politicians for the last 9 years.
First
of all, sanctions will harm Belarus
наблюдателями, observers, того, как за 2-3 года Беларусь станет частью России. Или вы с этим соглашаетесь сегодня и ничего не делаете, тогда и нет необходимости вводить санкции. Второй аргумент, второй тезис, это связанный с влиянием на белорусское общество. Белорусы готовы терпеть санкции в течение месяцев, но не готовы жить годы, многие годы.
So Belarusians are ready to suffer, but they don't want to do this. It will lead to the most significant migration outside Belarus. The fact that this incident with Ryanair plane took place shows that regime is ready to commit terrorist acts. That the atomic plant in Astravets is becoming more prominent. This is already a nuclear threat. Lukashenko will use this both in his declarations and real actions. Well, the politicians need to understand this, finally. The next element is the legal pressure. For this, we need to have not only the desire of the law defenders, but also we need to have conventions of UN against torture working here, so-called universal jurisdictions. So far, we've seen only 2 countries like Germany and Lithuania going this way. Other companies are moving away from this topic, not making political solutions in order to use the legal ways of putting pressure on the perpetrators. Next is the Hague Court, International Court of Justice. We hope that there will be a precedent of charging the people who are responsible for this. The next tool is the opening of criminal cases about the hijacking of an airplane in Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and Ireland. I hope that Ireland will also follow this path. So these are the most important things for now. I would echo Olga Kaverkova, who said that, and I will say that first, we must put back on the sanctions list the people who used to be there over the last 20 years, who were there in the last 20 years. It is the fact that they were removed from those lists and that they were not punished shows that even they may get away with it. What is the foundation for this? Between the regime and the EU, there was a oral political diplomatic agreement that there should be release of political prisoners and those lists will be banned. The regime has violated this agreement. It put more political prisoners into jail, and it gives the full right to the EU to automatically, without further discussions, to bring back those who were in the sanctions list, to impose sanctions on them and stop them from entering the EU. The economic sanctions. We're saying that they need to be significant, effective, and very powerful. Only then they will be short-term in nature. Saying that the sanctions don't give effect is wrong, because there are no sanctions. Nobody has tried applying them. If these are sectoral sanctions towards petrochemicals, energy sector, financial sector, only then there will be influence in the regime, and this will allow us to mobilize people for them to win in this very complicated but so important battle, which is important not only for Belarusians and for Europeans, but the whole of the world and Europe. And next stage is clear: elections of the president, using the old constitution, and then we need to have the new constitution, have the move to a parliamentary republic. If we follow the other way, we have the constitutional reform first, we may have a revenge when the non-legitimate parliament will try to regain power. I think the lawyers understand what I mean. Thank you once again, the organizers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lakushka, for these reflections. I think what you said at the end about the sequences, that is something we should discuss here more. That's very interesting. Before we do so, I come to last but not least, Ambassador Ursula Gacek. Ursula Gacek is previously, I understand, a financial analyst, and then she moved into politics. She became a member of the Polish Senate and then also of the European Parliament for the Polish Civic Platform Party. And as you know, many Polish people are supporting the cause of Belarus and the cause of democratization in Eastern Europe. And she is one of them, and has also served in diplomatic capacity as the Polish permanent representative to the Council of Europe, also as the Consul General to New York for Poland. And she has headed OSCD, ODIHR election observation missions in various countries. So she has been quite involved with the ins and outs of democratic election, also in countries where there were lots of challenges towards them. And Ambassador, I look forward to hear from you your thoughts on the situation now in Belarus and the option of elections. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak on what is no easy subject. There is no simple recipe. There is no easy how-to guide for the pro-democracy forces in Belarus when it comes to conducting and winning, hopefully, democratic elections as a means of removing the current regime. Nevertheless, the task ahead is to prepare for them. The recent history of the past 3 decades in this part of Europe, I'm speaking to you this afternoon from Poland, has numerous examples of attempts to end autocratic regimes via elections, many ending in success, but some, especially in the former Soviet republics, in failure. Identifying the factors that played the key role in determining the outcome has proven to be extremely difficult. Back in 2010, a little old now, but nevertheless an excellent comparative study by Bunsen Volchik is a brilliant analysis of just how difficult it is to pin down the variables that actually make the success. Even if we do manage to succeed in identifying some of these factors, many of them will be external in nature. When I use the word external, don't confuse that with international. By external, I mean those which are outside the control and outside the influence of today's opposition forces. Those are the factors that will require that the current regime sits down and negotiates, relinquishes at least some of the unfair advantage it has over the opposition. And so a lot has been said on the external factors, but today in my 5 minutes, I would like to focus on 3 areas in which I believe the opposition does have the ability to change something. It does have influence on attainable and hopefully workable goals. Elections will come around in Belarus, be they local, parliamentary, or of course the all-important and key presidential ones. And while waiting for them, what can the opposition do? Do they just sit it out, wait for the regime to collapse under the strain of economic sanctions or not? We've heard that with the support of Moscow, those sanctions may not be as painful as the EU hopes, or under the weight of its own corruption. Are the protests that we see, although unprecedented in length and scope, enough to focus on for now? Sooner or later, that window of election opportunity will open, and hopefully sooner as the severity of repressions, the greater willingness to flout international law, as shown by the diversion of an international flight, as well as willingness to flout domestic law, can be viewed rather as symptomatic of a weakening regime rather than a strengthening one. So what can the opposition forces do realistically, bearing in mind all the constraints, the lack of the playing field? The suggestions I make are not an alternative to negotiations for change. They're not an alternative to working towards a new electoral code, a new electoral administration, but they are immediate actions I hope that we will be able to discuss. So the first one is to prepare to cooperate as opposition. In the past, it's been far too easy to blame opposition, not only in Belarus, but in other countries hoping to move towards transition, to blame them for their election failure because of an ability to unite. I intentionally use the word cooperate rather than the word unite, because the task of winning an election in such a situation is far, far more complex. If it was just as simple as uniting the opposition, we would probably have solved this problem a decade ago. And also because I'm a former politician and I'm realistic and I know about the internal dynamics of politics. But there will be elections in which uniting forces around one opposition candidate will be expedient. Most likely this will be the presidential election. But unity may not be essential in what may well come sooner unless the election calendar shifts dramatically, and that will be elections at a local or parliamentary level. But cooperation is still very important. I think the thing to keep in mind is who is the real enemy here and who is just your competitor. And so the regime will play on every fear of a disoriented electorate, suggesting destabilization, ramping up fears of destabilization, and paradoxically, even in an economic downturn stemming from sanctions can play into the hands of the regime. The voter will be looking for an alternative, and they should not see an opposition sniping at each other. They might have different visions of the future, but on the fundamentals, I hope that there will be cooperation and a common vision. The second thing that I would suggest is important to prepare for is to prepare to campaign. I have no doubt whatsoever that today's leaders of the pro-democratic forces in Belarus are passionate, courageous, and fiercely dedicated to their cause. However, 27 years of an increasingly autocratic regime has robbed them of an opportunity to simply be politicians in a normal functioning democracy, to gain experience of a normal campaign, which is the first hurdle they will face. A tightly controlled propaganda machine robs them of access to real opinion polls and hence of knowledge to what the Belarusian people actually want. A system of corrupt patronage on one side and repression and intimidation on the other has robbed them of natural constituencies of potential voters. This is all compounded by voters' perception that nothing can change, that elections are invariably rigged. Against this backdrop, putting together a positive and credible alternative in line with the real hopes and expectations of the disillusioned and disheartened electorate is as important as it is difficult. There may be discussions on whether, for example, to boycott some of the less important elections, maybe the local elections. From my own political, diplomatic, and election observation experience, I would say use every chance you get to promote your cause, to promote your leaders, to promote your platform and your vision. I rarely have seen boycotting bringing about the desired effect. And secondly, as politicians, be prepared to answer the question. So once you've toppled this regime, what then? Remember, the regime will paint the opposition forces as destructive destabilizers. They must have an idea of what the average voter wants, what he or she stands to gain under a new democratic administration they hope to be part of. And they must be able to convey this message to the electorate, despite the limitations on freedom of expression. And finally, prepare to verify and monitor elections. Maybe things will be great, and maybe events will take such a turn that the next election is conducted within a legal framework and with an election administration that gives confidence in the process. That unlike 2020, international election observers from the OSCE's Office for Democratic and Institutional and Human Rights will again be admitted to Belarus. But whilst hoping for the best, prepare for a situation where the system is still far from perfect, or that the trust in the process will not have been rebuilt despite reforms. Opposition can work with civil society to provide opinion polls, exit polls, domestic observation, and parallel tabulation. Working on such projects has an additional advantage. It will cement civil society and opposition relationships. It builds trust, it builds support networks, it gives access to expertise and to funding. Autocratic regimes are always very fearful of close cooperation between opposition and civil society. I hope that in this brief introduction, I've introduced some realistic, attainable, and immediate actions that can be taken by the democratic opposition. Actions that will be, of course, part of a much wider range of activities undertaken not only by them, but also by the international community and those that will be discussed in the panels, the technical panels that follow on from this one. Steps that can be taken so that when that window of opportunity opens for the opposition, they will be in the very best place they can be to seize that moment and to seize that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the fine-grained view on this situation. It makes a lot of sense to me. I think if I look at various transitions, when they happen, they can have very different shapes. Sometimes you have a complete collapse of a regime, which in a way makes rebuilding easier. It can be difficult because there's a huge vacuum, but there tends to be less resistance. I've also seen transitions where figures were changed, but the same structures managed the entire transition, and it never became really credible and never really involved people's aspirations. And that's also a risk. And the other one are really negotiated transitions where you don't hold all the cards. And I think that was a bit your directions, and those are difficult and they're far from perfect. And you may not have a level playing field, and yet it may be worth going into it because it's the best opportunity you have. And if it's worth it or not, of course, it's very much a case-by-case questions. But I think thinking along these lines is really important to define in a way what are the minimum conditions under which one would go into such a process. What would one negotiate for? And that's technical issues. I think that would be very interesting to explore here. Some speakers spoke about international sanctions and the positioning of EU and others. I understand that's a big subject now. I would park it a little bit for our discussion today because I think these demands make a lot of sense, but we are not necessarily the group who can do a lot about it. I think we come more from the side of democracy and election expertise, and I think these demands have been made very clearly by many Belarusian players and are well known in many capitals. We have a number of questions here, and I would invite those questioners now. And I would start with Ms. Laima Andrikienė from Lithuania, a member of parliament and also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. You have the floor for a comment or a question.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Laima Andrikienė. I'm from the Lithuanian Parliament, and I am also the Vice President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. First of all, I would like to thank Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and Alex Schlick for organizing this conference. And it's a pleasure to see Ursula Gatzek, my former colleague in the European Parliament. My question is on the need for electoral reform in Belarus, in the country where the crackdown on civil society, journalists and activists continue. As we know, there are more than 400 political prisoners, and this figure is increasing. Lukashenko's plan of so-called constitutional reform indicates that his regime is attempting to delay it as much as possible and preserve the status quo. There are very important positive trends to be taken into consideration. Pro-democracy movement is self-transforming into decentralized self-organization, which makes it more resilient against regimes' attempts to control it. We also observe a new way of thinking and generational changes within Belarusian society, the rebirth of Belarusian nation. And democratic forces are seeking, as we know, genuine and democratic elections as soon as possible this year. So today, I understand that we speak about a negotiated solution, or in other words, possibility of snap elections and new and independent Central Election Commission. In this context, some politicians argue that Belarus needs a massive and urgent reform of the electoral law before elections take place. And that was very visible in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe when we debated a reform exactly about the urgent need for electoral reform in Belarus. My understanding is that there is a hope for good elections if new people are in charge and amend the practice and the application of the rules within the framework of the current law. That is what I believe in. So my question to all Belarusian panelists is, do you think it is doable? Is it a realistic scenario to have independent Central Election Commission and to organize snap elections, rejecting the idea of massive reform of the electoral law, which to my mind is very similar to Lukashenko's idea of the constitutional reform? Do you, dear Belarusian friends, do you feel strong enough to achieve that, to convince your compatriots that these minimal changes will be enough to have democratic elections meeting international standards? Thank you.
Thank you. That strikes me as a very interesting question. Where does real reform begin, even if not complete? Where is it still a facade process? I suggest the following. I have one more question from a participant from abroad, and I will call her in. So we gather this question, and then I go back to the panelists. And I also know that we have a colleague from Belarus, from the Christian Democratic Party, who will give us a comment. But I gather these two international comments here first. And I think the second person we have is Eva Nielsen from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden. Ms. Nielsen, if you are online, you can pose your question here. I don't see you. Doesn't seem to be the case at this point. So we come back to you, and maybe then I give the floor to Vital Rima-Shoysky from the Christian Democrats in Belarus for a question or a quick remark. Vital, are you there? Not lucky with these two at the moment. Well, I think the questions and comments were already very interesting. So I would like to pass to you this question.
Извините, у меня технические были проблемы с доступом. Я могу говорить, да?
I'm sorry, I've had some technical difficulties. Good afternoon. I thank the organizers, and I'm happy to take part. I'm on the road right now. So as a point of discussion, I wanted to offer the following comment. We're talking about negotiations and free elections. Unfortunately, there is no doubt that the regime is not ready for the negotiations. As a reply to a call to negotiations, new criminal charges are being pressed against us. The current rhetoric presupposes some of the elements or tools of the past. Olga Kaverkova mentioned that we need a holistic approach. We need to rethink the whole toolkit that the EU has in working with authoritarian regimes. I don't think it's correct to raise a question of negotiations. It's more about dialogue that we should be talking about, because negotiations is something that you conduct with an enemy, and all the victims that we've had during the election and post-election, no one was liable for that. So it's important to remember the context. And we need to remember that Vladimir Putin is involved in this. And the same goes for Transnistria, Abkhazia. We wouldn't have these black holes if Russia wasn't involved, and we must not turn a blind eye to it. If we take Belarus as a separate case and look at it outside of the context of support, including military support, I think we all remember that Russia was willing to deploy its forces. So it's important to revise the way you treat authoritarian regimes. I'm not saying we need to negate negotiations. It's just that we need to learn lessons. Otherwise, we will not succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Vital. I can add this, I think, to the question here. And now I see that we may have a chance to hear from Eva Nielsen. Is that so? She's promoted to panelist, I see, so she may show up here, but it doesn't seem to work. Well, I would say, let me go back to the panel here. So I think the questions raised very much highlight a bit this big question mark. Why are we talking about things like negotiations at this point? And I think it's always important to say, as Ambassador Gacek said, it's about scenarios. It's not saying that it's happening this afternoon, but there may be a moment where it's happening. I think, Franak, you said in the beginning, the regime now is devoid of any legitimacy. So there could be a situation when it wants to get back legitimacy and pay a price of a slight opening. This is a typical scenario, and that then brings negotiations. And the question is, what would be the minimum lines? Would that be, is there a clear idea about quick fixes that would be good enough? Or is there the risk, as our Lithuanian colleague said, that this is only a facade action which doesn't bring anything except some legitimacy gains for people who don't have any? And I go maybe back in the same sequence as before and give you the floor, Franak, to share your thoughts about this question. I'm not too lucky here with responses. Franak, I park you if you give me a sign when you're online or when you hear me. And maybe Olga, I see you and I think you hear me. Olga, what are your thoughts?
Да, смотрите, я хотела бы несколько моментов подчеркнуть.
There are a few points I'd like to cover. Ms. Ursula mentioned that boycott or elections, proactive position implies participation in all the processes, and it's important to get your message across. For the first time, local elections are likely to be cancelled by a decision of the parliament. And for the first time, it will be done not through referendum, which means the government continues to disregard people. And they're showing that he can delay or procrastinate elections without consulting with the others. As a politician who contributed to various campaigns, we boycotted elections, and I think when we don't participate, we teach people not to participate in processes, and elections is one of the tools where you can actually show high level of participation. Concerning changes in the law, for many years now, pro-democratic forces have tried to monitor elections in different shapes and forms, suggesting modifications to the electoral law. Unfortunately, none of those recommendations were ever followed. I'm sure that even under the current law, we can conduct free elections. It's just that there is no political will. I mean, it's easy to count votes, to display each and every ballot. It's just the political will is not there. And Belarusian people need to have trust. And the trust will be there only if we know that election commissions are composed not only from government representatives, but from other organizations and forces as well. This is very real. The political will is lacking. So when we talk about negotiations and sanctions, sanctions is a tool to force to be involved in negotiations. But when we realize that there are preconditions in place, there is no need for sanctions. Today, amid growing number of political prisoners and all the reprisals, it's hard to speak about political process because we don't see that the current government is open for it. It's the crisis of the entire Belarusian society. And to overcome this obstacle, it will take the whole country. What we see thus far is ceding statehood. So I think it's time for everyone who lives in Belarus to stay together, to continue to develop Belarus as a country and not to destroy what we have. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we certainly all agree that the political will is key, that it's not there now. At the same time, what you say, I think is important. Possible postponement of local elections. If I understand correctly, also the celebrations for 8th of 9th of May were postponed or not held. So there's a real fear of any kind of mobilization. And that's important to note, I think, that this current regime has no confidence in any of these processes anymore and is afraid that they could all go wrong. Franak, you are back. Let us know what you think.
Sure, I will start with local elections. This is definitely the sign of the weakness of Lukashenko and the sign that he is afraid of any form of activities. Я переключусь на белорусскую, знову почав по-англійську. Ясно, що Лукашенко...
It's clear that Lukashenko does not want an active society. Those structures that appeared in fall last year, this is a quite natural civil society that he doesn't understand. We are sure that new presidential and parliamentary elections that held at the same time, they are possible. And looking at the very rapid sequence of events, I think the call for negotiations would develop. Our task is to prepare conditions to have a kind of Sebastian Kurz as a mediator, to have Merkel and Macron that who are ready to be guarantors, to have the parliamentary as OC parliamentary assembly as the platform for the negotiations. Many make comparisons with negotiations in Poland or negotiations in Ukraine that led to nowhere. But one can compare with negotiations with in South Africa following after apartheid. So they launched the process, and nobody was sure. And finally, this process led South Africa to democracy. One does not exclude another. The pressure increases only our negotiation position. Nobody is sure that Lukashenko would be a good negotiator. So most probably we would have negotiations with those people who are around the regime, represent different interests. So the businessmen, local officials, those who would participate in some manners to participate in building new Belarus. So negotiations are part of the dialogue. Well, they are not solutions. So, but the elections would satisfy all sides, and they would help to close the gap of a problem, lack of legitimacy. So after that, we would talk about the justice, the reconciliation in the society, and bringing to justice and to the Belarusian justice and the international justice, also responsible in crimes. So we should talk about these problems. We know them, but we should know that when the moment comes, we should be prepared, and we are prepared to solve the problems. Well, but no avoidance of responsibility for the crimes of the regime. This is our principled position.
Thank you very much. And I pass over to Pavel Latushka. So you know the scene very well also, and how does this discussion sound to you about, you know, possible openings, maybe the scenario of an opening towards some negotiations where you know, you have to talk about minimum conditions or something like that.
Thank you for this. I would like to support Olga Kaverkova. We have very similar positions, which shows again the unity of democratic forces, the issue of trust to the democratic system, to the institution of elections in Belarus is the key one. I don't think that today the amendment of the electoral code is the most important step. I think the most important thing is to reinstatement of trust to the electoral system, to the structures that have to and are there to provide elections. It is the executive power who is doing everything in order to interfere with elections. It's the ideological power, the mass media who are not free and democratic and influence the democratic process in Belarus, and the institutions that are responsible for holding the elections, the CEC, the PEC, and the local election commissions. And here we see the trust to these institutions being undermined. They are one thing that represents the regime, one thing that is working towards the single result, providing a fictional victory to the illegitimate authorities in any electoral campaign. Until the trust is reinstated, the trust of them, we shouldn't be in the position to talk about elections. Can we talk about the elections when the presidential candidates who collect signatures in favor of the candidature and people who supported him, signed in favor of him, are repressed and are sacked, 18 representatives of the National Legal Center were sacked for the reason that they signed at some point back or a year ago for Viktor Babarika. Can we talk about the trust to the electoral system when today in Belarus we no longer have free media de facto? The last powerful media resource, TUT.by, was liquidated, was closed down in Belarus, and its management were put in jail, and their staff members were put in jail. So can we no longer can get any news from them? Is there trust to the members of the PCCC and local election commissions who falsify, rig the elections when it's impossible to observe the electoral process in Belarus? So let's all openly state that today, without the change in the power or people in power in the country, it's impossible to hold elections. It's absolutely impossible. If we cannot call it either electoral campaign, electoral process, or elections. It will be basically appointment of the people that the authorities want to appoint in some positions to the local executive bodies and to the parliament. Europe and all the experts should understand this. So I'm taking you to the main point. It is the change, political change in Belarus, when the person responsible for repression in Belarus and the system that he has created goes down, when they leave, only then we can discuss various elements connected with the change in the elections, holding elections, control, and so on. But I reiterate, with the presence of the political will that we don't have in the country, allows us to conduct the high-level democratic elections in the country. In the future, we may involve to the amendment of the legislation based on the nature of the political changes. If it's a parliamentary republic, it's one approach, and the experience accumulated by the European bodies and accumulated by the OSCE or DIR will undoubtedly be important for us. I don't see any barriers to its implementation in the short term, but the only way here, the only approach here is to acknowledge, recognize Lukashenko as international terrorist from the point of view of international law, when he has no other choice and he will have to leave the post. Whether it happens fast depends on Belarusians, whether it happens slow also depends on Belarusians, but it's the major goal that we need to concentrate on. So talking today about the holding elections with Lukashenko in power, even using some preliminary dialogue, I think it's useless, it's fruitless, because the elections in this case will be non-free, non-democratic, and will not represent the political views of Belarus. And Belarusians are clearly showing that over 80% of the population are not supporting the regime of Lukashenko.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I think there's agreement that this is not the moment to say one starts negotiation, because there's no opposite side to do that at this point. But I would maybe give the floor back to Ambassador Gacek. The question being one of scenarios. So what if a scenario occurs where there is some negotiation with somebody who wants to not lose everything, but is willing to give a little bit, and what should that give be? And therefore, to put it in more simple words, what would be minimum conditions if we assume that elections tomorrow wouldn't look like election in Sweden, perhaps, but what would be an acceptable minimum of election conditions if such a possibility opens? So what should one ask for in a negotiation? What would be the bottom line? What would be the red lines, the good enough, if you want? Ambassador, what do you think?
Thank you, Michael. Well, it's very disheartening to hear that local elections might be cancelled. It's just another indication, I think, that we're a long way from getting to a stage where Lukashenko wants to sit down and negotiate, that he feels that he has no other option. He obviously has a lot of options in his own perception at the moment. I think the biggest danger would be that if he was pressed and felt that he did have to make some kind of concession, that that the international community and the Belarusian people would be hoodwinked or appeased into feeling that a little bit of window dressing and a little bit of tinkering with the electoral code is going to be sufficient to conduct elections that come up to international standards. There's much more to an election than what is written in the electoral code and what the Central Election Commission, even if it is an independent one, is able to do. Without the possibility of voters making an informed choice, there can be no free election. So whilst there is not sufficient access to independent media and independent opinion, it is possible that even a reformed electoral code could lead to the same result. I mean, people in Belarus, they're dissatisfied with what they have, but it is always possible at the last minute to throw populist incentives in front of maybe less educated, less politically aware, less motivated voters. So I would say an independent access to opinion where they can make an informed choice. Secondly, the opposition must be able to campaign unhindered. If the reaction to somebody who looks as if they are in with a chance of having some kind of decent result is to throw them into prison, then you must have recourse to an independent and impartial judiciary. Who can get somebody like that out of prison if the judges are not willing to treat cases on their merits? So without reform of the judiciary, without certainty of an independent judiciary, the electoral process is extremely difficult for an election to be undertaken in a democratic way. And finally, this was mentioned, voters must be free to cast their vote or to collect signatures or to express their political preference in a way which is free from intimidation. We cannot demand heroic actions of the average Belarusian citizen, people who have jobs, wives, husbands, children. Some people will be brave enough, will be determined enough, but we cannot demand it of everybody. So we have to ensure that the system is safe for them, that they can cast their vote confident that the vote is cast in secrecy and that there is no intimidation or reprisal for openly proclaiming your political preferences, which of course you do once you put your signature to a candidate list, once you actively participate in a candidate's campaign or actually campaign yourself. There is much more to an election than just the electoral code, just like there is much more to observation, which always comes as a surprise for the uninitiated, than just watching people drop ballots in ballot boxes and then for the counting and tabulation of those votes. If that was the case, ODIHR would not be observing the whole process from the day a campaign kicks off and even sometimes earlier. I do recognize the important role already citizen observers have played in elections, especially in 2020 when ODIHR was not able to be present. And I also share your frustrations that your recommendations, just like the recommendations of ODIHR, have not been acted on and have not been, there has been no reaction to so many of them. So I think I didn't even go into the area of negotiations because I just felt that the situation at this moment is not ready for negotiation. But as you said, Michael, things can turn in a moment and sometimes very small actions can bring an avalanche. And so that's why I also thought about the preparation that can be made given the scenario that I think currently exists. And that is one where still there is not the will, the political will for negotiation. And if there was the political will to hold free and fair elections, it is quite possible that it could be done within under the auspices of the law as it stands, maybe just ensuring that the election administration was independently elected and gave a guarantee of impartiality and restored some confidence in the system. So no easy answers, I'm sorry, to this one.
Thank you very much. I see that we have 10 more minutes in this session. From what you said, I would maybe put one more question, quite basic, on the table, which is it even useful to discuss these scenario details? I hear a lot of skepticism whether it is. At the same time, I see many people working on those scenarios. I have my own opinion, which I reserve maybe to the end of the session. And I would just invite all panelists who want to answer this question or comment on anything else in this session to raise your hands now. And this would be then also your final statement in this panel. And I think Olga already raised her hand, and anybody else from the panel can also put up their hands for further contributions. Olga, please.
Спасибо. На самом деле, я хотела бы обратить внимание еще.
Thank you very much. I would like to focus on another aspect that we have touched upon, which is as important as the pressure in new election. It is the growing resources, means that democratic community, we need to grow our democratic potential steadily inside our country. And opposing the challenges, we can do it only with the help of the structured civil society. 2020 is the beginning point of many things. I think we need to focus on this again. Also, we are engaging in this because we spoke about decentralizing today. It is a very important aspect because how much different was last campaign with the previous one. Business approaches penetrated into the electoral process. And this is very much about democracy. This is where the journey starts.
They led people, and this is one of the distinguishing features of formative civil society. Previously, elections were mainly in the field of negotiations between the government and foreign countries. Now, people want to elect their government. Also, we need to consider assistance to media, to civil society, because this is here and now politics. We don't know how scenarios will unfold, what other black swans will appear, but we need to build up the political force that will be fighting for power in Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you. And last invitation, would any other panelists like to comment more? Yes, Franak, please.
Я так само подсумую.
Also want to say, sum up our discussion, I think that everyone agrees that elections there are different ways to elections, and we need to create possibilities so the elections take place. So we have to change the legal acts, but at the same time, we have to make legacy in our country as well. Regime of Lukashenko doesn't care about any legal acts, about law. So that's why we're working in Belarus, we're growing our resources. We are building the civil society, proto-state institutions, bodies of civic control, which can help our organization and help to grow democracy. We are growing different groups, negotiation groups. We're preparing specialists, professionals for organizing elections, those who can become members of election commissions and those who can administer elections in the country. And of course, we're waiting support of international bodies like OSCE, but of course, we need internal structures who can be mediators and guarantee us success. I want to thank all the panelists, and I think that elections will take place as soon as possible. We hope for that. It's our objectives to hold elections this year, and we are ready to communicate on different levels, this to come true.
Thank you very much for the closing remarks. And Ambassador Gacek, I think you also wanted to add something.
Yes, I'm unmuted. So a very final sentence. It's very encouraging to hear that despite the repressions, despite the courage this takes, there is a vast reservoir of increasingly disgruntled citizens, and the unprecedented level of public protest is a testimony to this. So tapping into that reservoir, which is effectively campaigning, it's also campaigning, but also addressing the final point that I mentioned in my opening remarks, and that is working with civil society to have some role in the election process whenever it takes place. Working with those disgruntled citizens could actually be the easiest way of addressing two of those suggestions that I made. And so I hope that we end on, despite the extremely complex and challenging situation in which our Belarusian colleagues and friends find themselves in, that we nevertheless end on some note of optimism from this panel, that this situation is nevertheless different from my own experiences, for example, working in the European Parliament or working closely with Belarusian opposition when I was head of the rapporteur group on democracy amongst the ambassadors in the Council of Europe. So let's hope that despite the challenges, the situation does have a spark of optimism somewhere along the line.
Thank you very much. I would subscribe very much to that. Of course, we all look for this moment of renewed optimism on the situation in Belarus. From my perspective, I see a very strong movement still, even though it's less visible on the ground. But it gives me the sense that the regime has lost its population, and I think Ambassador knows that well from Poland in the 80s, that it's just the facade that's left. The big question is how long it remains standing. But what encourages me is that there is so much thinking and preparation, if you want, by opposition figures and by those who work towards democracy. And I think what this event tries to do is a little bit to look at possible eventualities and what would be the game plans that you need in those moments, and to have zero naivety about those situations and to have very high technical skills. And I see a lot of good technicians, if you want, on all these questions. And tomorrow we go even deeper into these so-called technical issues, which are all, of course, very political. And I invite you all to join us tomorrow starting at 3 o'clock with two very interesting panels, 3 o'clock Minsk time in Western Europe or in Central Europe, Warsaw, that would be 2 o'clock like today morning in the US. I hope to see all of you again at that time. I want to thank again Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, her team, for holding this, for the privilege of our organization to be part of it. I want to thank International IDEA, and maybe special thanks to IFES because they organized all this, and we all know it's really a lot of work to do technical preparations of these kind of online meetings. So I want to thank you as well. And before you leave the meeting, please let me hand over for the final closure to Alexander. Thank you very much. Very good to meet you.
Большое спасибо, Михаил. Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. I thank the panelists of the last panel for today. It was interesting and very useful. A lot of food for thought that we need to absorb and channel into further discussions. Tomorrow, you're all invited to the continuation of the conference. We'll have two panels, one on the short-term approaches to the reform and the other panel focusing on the longer-term approach. I'd like to thank IFES, DRI, IDEA. Special thanks to the high-level panel, to Beata, who moderated it so skillfully. I'm overwhelmed not only with the depth of discussion, but also with how punctual we are with sticking to the time limits, which means we have capability not only to talk, discuss at high level, but also technical ability to stick to all the rules. Thank you. So tomorrow, please use the same link to join the conference. No new links will be sent to you. So the same link, basically, for 2 days of the conference. This is the end of day one. Thank you once again. I thank the interpreters and see you all tomorrow at 1500 hours Minsk time.